Thank you so much for being here. My presentation in this session is a bit the odd one out because I'm not going to be talking about language, although I will be staying in the theme of communication. And I don't have, as you see, any nice trees or statistics, but I have some nice images that I hope you can see. I'm going to be talking about this, basically, which is visual art, and particularly the Pleistocene visual art. And now we know that this has much more deeper roots than we used to think. We used to think it used to start up here in the Upper Paleolithic in Europe. Now we know it starts in Africa very early on, around 120,000 years ago. So art as communication is an old topic. In the 60s and even before that, it's been there. Everybody talks about how visual art is a good media for communication. However, these previous views of art as communication have focused on content. They have seen art as information, and they have understood communication as a process of basically information exchange. But I suggest that this has not been a very good productive approach, because although it explains some things, and particularly some how information moves around networks and how information can be exchanged between cultures, it really doesn't tell us much about why or what is precisely the role that art can play as communication. So I suggest that we should switch from seeing communication in an informational approach to the biological approach, which is very, very simple switch, but it's a very important one. Because instead of seeing art as information, we can see art as a signal. And instead of focusing on information exchange and on science and information, we should actually move back to the basic structure of communication systems, which is signals and agents. And if we make that switch, we can actually start thinking about the role that art could have played as an information signal in the Pleistocene. So when we do this switch and we look at art as actually as a signal and not as information, we can see that it has a lot in common with all communication signals in biological communication. So other things like birdsong and other communication signals do all these things. We know that the point in biology, the point in communication is not information exchange, it's actually sending information, but to influence the behavior of another, to coordinate action between agents. And we see that basically visual art does that as well. And then it can do that, for instance, actually anthropologist Martin Wobb said it very nicely. It said that visual art or style is signaling in the artifact mode, because then the artifact becomes the stimulus, becomes a signal that is influencing the viewer, the perceiver, to coordinate action between agents. So when we look at it that way, then we can start to understand what sorts of behaviors visual art is trying to influence. And we see that particularly the most topical, you all linguists may know, most topical views of evolution of language look at language as basically, as Tomasello would say, basically a cooperative behavior. So it's up there with all the other cooperative behaviors that we know from humans, and we know humans are very much cooperative apes, and we know also that it starts very early in childhood, that there are some pro-social behaviors that appear spontaneously very early on. And communication apparently also tends to be very pro-social. And so how can visual art fit here? If we see that basically cooperation and pro-social behaviors are a selective pressure for communication in humans, and visual art is understood as a part of that communication, then we can extrapolate that also those selective pressures of cooperation are acting on visual art. But if we are so, as we know from archaeology, language probably is earlier than visual art, then why was visual art necessary in human interaction? And this, I think, refers us to the very specific human strategies for cooperation, which are basically reciprocity systems, so both direct and indirect. And these systems rely heavily on individual recognition. So agents will engage in cooperation as long as they know that they will be reciprocated in the long run or in the short run. And so this trying to remember who did what to whom and if somebody will reciprocate or not is very cognitively costly. So this has constraints on memory, and we know that our memory is not that good. We know Robin Dunbar, with his correlation with neocortex size and group size, has figured out that the average human network is about 150 persons, and that's the amount of relationships that we can actually trace face to face, that we can remember who's who and doing what and related to whom and so on. And in general, more or less, the amount of names and people that we can recall quite accurately is around 500. And beyond that, our memory starts making quite a lot of mistakes. So to engage in large-scale cooperation beyond this cognitive group would require something else to help us overcome these constraints in memory. And so these are the different constraints that are the pressures that are applying on memory. And we know also that we somehow were able to overcome these problems, otherwise we wouldn't have these huge cooperation networks that we have today. And there are basically two different strategies that we can use. One is cognitive, which is thinking in categories instead of individuals, and we tend to do this, for instance, as biologists, we think of plants and trees instead of the names of each plant and each tree, which is actually the ways in which many hunter-gatherers think. Instead of thinking in categories, they remember the names of all the plants and all the animals in their environment. But we live in a world where it would be impossible to do, we think in categories. And the other strategy that we can use is thinking, is a cultural strategy, which is just attaching one of those categories to something in material culture, and using that to recall those categories in memory. So sign-based recalling, sign-based memory systems are important for humans, and we know that this happens. There are many research studies that see that humans use visual information to recall and to remember. So it is very possible that these selective pressures also acted on visual art, and that visual art is a type of material culture that actually relies on style to stimulate and to coordinate action and to influence the viewer. And style is actually not very difficult. We don't need to say that style requires something as agency to arise. We know that style can arise, can emerge from interaction, and just by living in a group. As you may know, dialects emerge spontaneously, and they then can be used as a social marker, and that's a style. We can say that that's a style in language. And the same happens in material culture. Just by living in a group and through social learning, styles can arise. And the difference with humans, because we know also, for instance, birds have dialects in their song, the difference with humans is that styles can be used as convention and can be used as social markers, and then they become traditions, and they can be actively socially transmitted, and so on. So if style arises in this way in material culture, we can see how visual art could have been used to recall certain issues and certain people. So it can be attached to identity, because the styles arise in a certain group. You can use that as a marker of certain people, and you can trace that in reputation networks, in cooperation networks. And these cooperation networks rely on reputation, because as you can see here, we can start here. So we were talking about how recognizing everyone in a group is important for engaging in cooperation. But as the groups become larger, it becomes more hard, more difficult to remember who everyone is in the network and who will reciprocate. And especially in indirect reciprocity, when you engage with somebody who is not going to reciprocate to you, but someone else from the group is going to reciprocate to you, then it becomes very important to know who is a good cooperator to guide your decision-making, whether you engage or not in cooperation. So when you don't have these face-to-face relationships that you can recall exactly anymore, then you will rely on material markers such as visual art, and then it becomes important to invest in visual art because it will be a marker of reputation in your cooperation network. So we can see it this way, that even though it might be a costly strategy, it's worth investing in visual art because it will become, in the end, it will be more beneficial in the long run. And basically, this is why signaling identity matters. And this is an important point because there's a lot of talk in archaeology about visual art being a signal of identity, but basically it's taken for granted and we don't really stop and think about why it's important signaling identity. If we are able to remember so many names and so many people, why would it matter to have some extra material markers that recall identity? And the point is that it's basically probably because of this issue of trying to remember reputation in a larger scale network. Oh, sorry. And when we see that, we can see that we have different adaptive benefits, and people, when they have tried to understand visual art in an evolutionary perspective, they have always talked about how visual art can improve mating opportunities, for instance, to increase fitness. And basically, when we look at other different human traits and cultural traits, most of the fitness enhancement properties have to do with enhancing foraging opportunities or lowering risk of death or conflict. And actually visual art can do all this because when you don't need, when you already recognize a style visually and you don't have to engage in face-to-face interactions to already know if somebody will reciprocate or to engage in cooperation, then you avoid conflict, but you also can strengthen cooperation networks with others, and you can lower the risk of conflict, you can lower death risk, and you can improve cooperation. So in that sense, you could have your nice potential adaptive benefits without having to invoke increasing mating opportunities and sexual selection like most of the evolutionary models have tried to do. And we can see that this actually, when we understand art as having an important, as playing an important role in cooperation networks, this ties very well with the archaeological data. Because we see that here, basically when we start seeing the emergence of things like personal ornaments in the archaeological record, we also see an increase in site numbers, an increase in raw material transfer, which indicates that actually the groups were becoming larger and that probably cooperation was starting to go beyond the kin network and the cognitive group. And then what we have in the Upper Paleolithic is actually not so much a qualitative change, but more a quantitative change. So cooperation in Upper Paleolithic goes, we know that the raw material transfer rates are much more larger, and we know that the regional styles start appearing, and so we can infer that also cooperation networks there were growing even more, and so we couldn't rely anymore in just personal signs of identity in a small scale, but you start seeing the emergence of big artistic traditions like the rock art in Portugal, Spain, and France, which actually are more specialized traditions that require the support of larger groups and larger societies. So this two-stage process of development in art actually ties well with the idea of cooperation networks changing and the role of visual art that visual art was playing as an index of identity and reputation within these cooperation networks. And that's all I have to say. Hope we have a few moments for questions. Thank you.
Thank you.